A Russian drone explodes inside a NATO country. Not near the border, not inside an empty field, inside a civilian apartment building. Within seconds, flames ripped through the structure as terrified civilians ran into the streets of Romania, a NATO member state. 2 people were injured. Emergency sirens echoed through the night, and suddenly, one terrifying question began spreading across Europe. Was this an accident? Or was Putin testing NATO itself? Because under Article 5, an attack on one NATO country is considered an attack on all 32 members of the alliance, and that changes everything. But this crisis did not begin with a drone strike. It began weeks earlier, deep inside a collapsing Russian war machine. Russian forces were losing territory. Crimea was entering logistical chaos. Ukraine's drones were reaching farther than ever before. And inside Russia itself, something almost unthinkable was happening. People were beginning to laugh at Putin. Now, as pressure builds from every direction, the Kremlin appears more unpredictable, more desperate, and potentially more dangerous than at any point since the invasion began. And this is where the situation became truly alarming. For months, the Kremlin promised victory. Russian state television repeated the same message almost every night. Ukrainian defenses were collapsing. Russian troops were advancing. Key strategic cities would soon fall. One city in particular became central to that narrative: Pokrovsk, a critical logistics hub in eastern Ukraine, a city that helps connect Ukrainian supply routes across the Donetsk front. If Russia captured it, the balance in eastern Ukraine could shift dramatically. Putin publicly claimed the city would fall by winter, but winter came and went, and Pokrovsk was still standing. Then the battlefield situation became even worse for Russia. Ukrainian counterattacks near surrounding settlements reportedly pushed Russian forces backward across multiple sectors. The territorial gains themselves were not enormous, but military analysts noticed something far more important. Momentum had changed. Russian forces were no longer simply stalled. In some areas, they were retreating. And what happened next changed everything. Russian military bloggers, usually loyal to the Kremlin, began openly admitting how severe the battlefield situation had become. One pro-Russian war analyst described Ukraine's drone superiority in shocking terms. According to him, Russian troops were facing waves of Ukrainian FPV drones in overwhelming numbers. In some sectors, soldiers reportedly faced dozens of drones for every single Russian fighter on the ground. That level of drone dominance changes modern warfare completely. It means movement becomes dangerous, supply lines become vulnerable, armor becomes exposed. Even rear positions stop feeling safe. And eventually, the pressure reached Putin himself. For the first time in weeks, the Russian president publicly acknowledged the growing threat inside Russian territory. Ukrainian drone strikes were now reaching deeper into Russia than ever before. Major attacks had already targeted Moscow and critical infrastructure hubs. But instead of admitting Ukrainian tactical success, Putin blamed the West. The Kremlin narrative shifted immediately. According to Moscow, Ukraine was only succeeding because NATO countries were supplying advanced technology, intelligence, and drones. But behind the propaganda, another reality was emerging. Inside Russia, public frustration was becoming harder to hide. Russian social media began circulating political jokes mocking the war effort and questioning why Russia still had not achieved victory after years of fighting. That might sound insignificant, but authoritarian systems fear ridicule more than criticism. Because once people begin mocking power, fear starts disappearing. And while the Kremlin struggled to maintain control over public perception, Ukraine was already preparing something even more devastating: a direct strike against one of the most notorious Russian military units of the entire war. Late at night, Ukrainian drones crossed deep behind Russian lines. Their targets were not random: training grounds, supply centers, fuel facilities, military staging areas. Then came the strike that sent shockwaves through both Russia and Ukraine. A base connected to Russia's 64th Motor Rifle Brigade was hit. That unit has long been linked by international investigators to the atrocities committed in Bucha during the early months of the invasion, one of the darkest chapters of the war. For years, many Ukrainians believed the men responsible would never face consequences. But Ukraine never stopped searching. And this is where the war entered a new phase. Because modern warfare is no longer only fought with tanks and missiles. It is fought with surveillance networks, drone intelligence, cyber tracking, and relentless long-term targeting operations. According to multiple reports, Ukraine has quietly built extensive systems dedicated to identifying Russian personnel connected to alleged war crimes. Investigators, hackers, drone units, intelligence officers, all working continuously to locate targets far beyond the front lines. And now those operations appear to be accelerating. The strike reportedly caused dozens of Russian casualties. But militarily, the psychological effect may have been even bigger. Russian troops are now being forced to consider a terrifying possibility. There may be nowhere truly safe anymore. Not at the front, not at training bases, not even deep inside Russian territory. But that was only the beginning. Because while Russia struggled with battlefield pressure and growing drone warfare, another crisis was unfolding in Crimea. And for Putin, Crimea is not just territory, it is political survival. Back in 2014, Putin's popularity inside Russia had weakened significantly. Economic pressure was growing, public frustration was rising. Then came the annexation of Crimea. Suddenly, everything changed. Russian nationalism exploded. Putin's approval ratings surged. The Kremlin portrayed Crimea as proof that Russia was becoming powerful again. In many ways, Crimea became the symbol of Putin's political identity, which is exactly why Ukraine's latest operations there are so dangerous. Ukraine reportedly launched what analysts describe as a logistical pressure campaign designed to isolate the peninsula from mainland Russian supply routes. Drone attacks targeted convoys, fuel shipments, transport vehicles, and logistical corridors feeding Crimea. Hundreds of vehicles were reportedly damaged or destroyed within days. And slowly, ordinary life inside Crimea began feeling the impact. Fuel shortages emerged. Long gas station lines formed. Residents posted videos online warning travelers that gasoline supplies were becoming unreliable. At first glance, that might not sound dramatic. But military history shows something important. Wars are often decided by logistics before they are decided by bullets. Fuel keeps armies moving. Fuel keeps supply chains alive. Fuel keeps air defenses functioning. Without stable logistics, even powerful militaries begin weakening from the inside. And this is where military analysts became deeply concerned. Because Ukraine was no longer simply defending territory, it was systematically targeting Russia's ability to sustain the war itself. Then came the moment nobody expected. A Russian drone crossed into Romania. Not Ukraine, Romania, a NATO country. The drone crashed into a residential building, injuring civilians and triggering immediate panic across Europe. Within hours, NATO officials confirmed the drone originated from Russia, and suddenly, one dangerous possibility began dominating geopolitical discussions. What if this was not accidental? Because this was not the first border incident involving Russian drones or aircraft. Over the past year, multiple reports documented Russian drones entering NATO airspace near Poland, Romania, and the Baltic region. Usually, the incidents ended with diplomatic protests and official condemnations, but this time felt different. Civilians had been injured, a residential structure had been hit, and Russia itself appeared increasingly unstable under mounting pressure. Military analysts immediately began discussing escalation scenarios. Would NATO increase deployments in Eastern Europe? Would air defense systems be expanded? Would fighter patrols intensify near the Black Sea? And perhaps most importantly, was Russia probing NATO's limits? Because from Moscow's perspective, testing Western reactions carries strategic value. Every delayed response can be interpreted as hesitation. Every weak statement can be viewed as opportunity. But NATO's reaction this time was noticeably stronger. Alliance officials reaffirmed that every inch of NATO territory would be defended. Western leaders condemned the strike rapidly. Surveillance and regional monitoring increased almost immediately. And then came another alarming signal. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev escalated his rhetoric once again, warning Europeans that they should no longer expect peaceful nights while supporting Ukraine. The message was clear: psychological pressure, fear, escalation. But many analysts also noticed something else. Russia's threats often intensify when the Kremlin feels cornered. And right now, pressure on Moscow is building from nearly every direction. Battlefield stagnation, drone vulnerability, fuel shortages, economic pressure, public frustration, international isolation. This combination creates an extremely dangerous environment. Because history shows that weakened authoritarian systems sometimes become more unpredictable, not less. And this is why the next phase of the war may become even more volatile. Not because Russia is winning, but because Russia may fear losing control. Meanwhile, NATO countries are now being forced to prepare for a future where the conflict no longer remains contained inside Ukraine. The Black Sea region is becoming increasingly militarized. Air defense systems are expanding. Electronic warfare operations are intensifying. Drone warfare is evolving almost weekly. And somewhere behind closed doors, Pentagon planners are already gaming out worst-case scenarios involving the Black Sea, Eastern Europe, and possible NATO escalation pathways. Because if one miscalculation spirals out of control, the consequences could extend far beyond Ukraine. Right now, Europe stands at a dangerous crossroads. Russia is under growing pressure. Ukraine is becoming more aggressive and technologically adaptive. And NATO is being pulled closer to the edge of direct confrontation. The drone strike inside Romania may ultimately prove to be an accident, or it may become remembered as something far more significant, a warning sign that the boundaries of this war are beginning to expand. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous, because history has shown many times that global conflicts rarely explode all at once. They escalate slowly, one incident at a time, one miscalculation at a time. So the question now is no longer whether tensions are rising. The real question is, how far is Putin willing to go before someone finally pushes back? And if that moment comes, what happens next?